Are you lost, sweetheart? The kitchen is that way. This is a restricted area for actual operators, the words, dripping with a venomous cocktail of condescension and arrogance, sliced through the low hum of the advanced training facility. The small crowd of young, sycophantic junior officers arrayed around Lieutenant Struck chuckled on cue, a pathetic chorus of nervous laughter that only served to amplify the insult. The woman, the target of his scorn, said nothing. She didn't even turn her head. Her gaze, calm and impossibly deep, remained fixed on the glowing blue schematics of the simulated submarine hull projected onto the main tactical display. Her stillness was absolute, a pocket of profound calm in a room crackling with ego and tension. But across the vast, cathedral-like training floor, where the scent of ozone and chlorinated water hung heavy in the air, Rear Admiral Thorne, a man whose face was a roadmap of forgotten conflicts, narrowed his eyes. He stopped his conversation mid-sentence, his attention captured not by the lieutenant's loud-mouthed preening, but by the woman's posture. He recognized something in the way she stood, a perfect economy of motion even in stillness, a rootedness to the deck plates that wasn't learned in officer candidate school. It was a stillness that belonged to a different kind of human being, one forged in the crucible of a different, more silent kind of war. Thorne felt a ghost of a memory stir, a whisper from a dusty, classified file he hadn't thought about in years. If you believe that true strength doesn't need to announce itself, type silence in the comments below. The woman, Senior Chief Petty Officer Anya Adebayo, though no one in this room knew her name or rank, continued to study the schematic. Her coveralls were plain, gray, and devoid of any insignia, the standard issue for civilian contractors and technical observers. She was of average height, with a wiry, athletic build that the loose-fitting garment deliberately obscured. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, functional knot. There was nothing about her that screamed threat or elite. She was designed to be overlooked, a ghost in the machine, and Lieutenant Struck, a man whose entire sense of self was built on the flimsy scaffolding of his rank and a superficial understanding of command, had walked right into the trap she unknowingly represented. He thrived on perceived weakness, and in his narrow worldview, a quiet, unassuming black woman in a technical bay was the lowest rung on the ladder. He saw her silence not as strength, but as submission. He saw her focus not as professional diligence, but as the clueless staring of someone out of their depth. His world was a simple one, divided into predators and prey, and he had just decided which one she was. The simulation they were about to run was a complex one, a pinnacle of naval special warfare training. It was a Tier 1 level exercise designed to test a SEAL team's ability to infiltrate a hostile, submerged submarine, neutralize its crew, and prevent the launch of a dirty bomb. The simulator, affectionately nicknamed the Leviathan, was a billion-dollar marvel of engineering, capable of replicating the crushing pressures, the freezing temperatures, and the claustrophobic terror of deep-sea operations with terrifying fidelity. Lieutenant Struck was the officer in charge of this particular evolution, a position that had inflated his already considerable ego to dangerous proportions. He saw himself as the gatekeeper to the world of the elite, and he guarded that gate with a sneer and a well-practiced tirade for anyone he deemed unworthy. Anya Adebayo had been sent by command so far above Struck's pay grade that it didn't even exist on his organizational charts. Her official purpose was to observe the new hydrostatic pressure equalization system under stress. But her real mission, known only to Admiral Thorne and a handful of others in the Pentagon, was to be a red cell operator. Her job was to find the breaking points, not just in the technology, but in the people. She was a human diagnostic tool, a walking, breathing stress test for the entire naval special warfare community. Struck, puffed up with his own importance, took another step toward her, enjoying the captive audience. "I'm talking to you," he said, his voice louder now, laced with irritation. "This isn't a museum. You can't just wander in here and stare at the pretty lights. State your name and purpose for being in my CNC." Anya finally turned her head, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't look at his face. Instead, her eyes briefly met the rank insignia on his collar, a flicker of acknowledgement so subtle it was almost imperceptible before returning to the schematic. "Observer," she said. Her voice was low and clear, a single word that carried no emotion, no defiance, no fear. It was a simple statement of fact. The utter lack of deference was a splash of cold water on Struck's ego. He expected cowering, apologies, a stammered explanation. He got a one-word answer and complete disinterest. The snickering from his acolytes died down, replaced by a tense curiosity. This wasn't following the usual script. Struck's face, handsome in a conventional, arrogant way, began to flush a deep, angry red. He was being dismissed. Publicly. He moved until he was standing directly in front of her, blocking her view of the screen. He was taller than her by a good 6 inches and used his height to loom, a classic intimidation tactic. "Observer? Observe what? How real men do their jobs. I have a SEAL team in the tube about to risk their simulated lives, and I have some civilian techie getting in my way. This is a closed environment. Your presence is a distraction and a security risk. Get out. Now." He punctuated the last word by jabbing a finger toward the exit hatch. Anya Adebayo didn't move. She simply shifted her gaze from the space where the screen had been to a secondary monitor displaying the vital signs of the SEALs in the dive chamber. Her focus was absolute. She was a predator, but not the kind Struck understood. She wasn't hunting him. She was hunting for data, for flaws, for the single thread that, when pulled, would unravel the entire tapestry. And in Lieutenant Struck's towering, fragile pride, she had just found it. His jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He had been challenged, his authority questioned by her monumental indifference. In his mind, he had no choice but to escalate. He had to reassert his dominance in a way that would be unmistakable to everyone watching. He reached out, not to jab his finger this time, but with an open palm. He didn't intend to just point. He intended to move her. He placed his hand on her shoulder, expecting to shove her aside easily. It was like pushing against a granite statue. She didn't budge, not a millimeter. The contact, the shocking solidity of her, seemed to short-circuit his brain. All his frustration, his wounded pride, his deep-seated insecurity coalesced into a single, disastrous impulse. His hand, still on her shoulder, clenched. His arm tensed, and in a moment of unforgivable, career-ending stupidity, he swung. It wasn't a full power punch, but it wasn't a shove either. It was a sharp, brutal strike, the heel of his palm connecting with the side of her jaw with a sickening, wet smack that echoed in the suddenly silent control room. He had struck her. A lieutenant in the United States Navy had physically struck a woman he believed to be a civilian in the middle of a high-security military installation. The collective gasp from the onlookers was sharp and immediate. Even Struck's most loyal sycophants looked horrified. Across the room, Admiral Thorne went rigid, his face turning to stone. He started to move, a thundercloud of fury gathering in his eyes. But he stopped. Because Anya Adebayo didn't fall. She didn't even stumble. She absorbed the full impact of the blow with a barely perceptible tightening of her neck muscles. Her head moved perhaps an inch, then snapped back to center. She didn't blink. Her expression didn't change. She just stood there, the red mark on her cheek already beginning to bloom, her eyes still fixed on the vital signs of the men in the tube. The only acknowledgement of the assault was that her right hand, which had been hanging loosely at her side, slowly, methodically, clenched into a fist so tight the knuckles went white. It was the fist of a person who knew, with absolute certainty, how to end a conflict, and was choosing, with monumental discipline, not to. The silence that followed the strike was a living thing. It was heavier than the water in the simulator, more crushing than any deep-sea pressure. In that silence, Lieutenant Struck's entire world began to crumble. He looked at his hand, then at her face, a dawning, terrifying realization that he had just made a mistake of a magnitude he couldn't yet comprehend. He had mistaken a resting lion for a stray cat, and he had just slapped it across the face. The silence was finally shattered, not by a voice, but by a klaxon, a shrill, piercing alarm blared through the control room, accompanied by a cacophony of automated warnings. Red lights flashed across every console, bathing the room in an apocalyptic glow. On the main screen, the schematic of the submarine was now a blinking Christmas tree of critical failures. "What the hell is that?" Struck yelled, his voice cracking, spinning away from Anya to face the board. His moment of violent stupidity was instantly eclipsed by a new, more immediate terror. A young ensign, his face pale with panic, pointed a trembling finger at a cascading scroll of error messages. "Sir, multiple system failure. The outer hatch release mechanism is offline. The hydrostatic equalizers are failing to engage. Sir, they're showing a pressure differential overload." In plain English, the SEAL team was trapped. The complex machinery designed to safely simulate a deep-sea environment had failed catastrophically. The outer hatch of the simulator, a multi-ton slab of reinforced steel, was jammed shut. Worse, the pressure systems were malfunctioning, meaning the water pressure inside the SEAL's compartment was rapidly increasing while the pressure outside remained stable. The differential was creating a force of thousands of pounds per square inch, effectively turning the hatch into an immovable wall. They were sealed in a metal tomb that was actively trying to crush them. "Well, fix it!" Struck screamed, his carefully constructed facade of command disintegrating into raw panic. He was an officer, a manager of men, but he was not an engineer. He looked at the complex controls, the endless lines of code and pressure readings, and saw only gibberish. He was a man given the keys to a supercar who had no idea how the engine worked. "Brute force it! Get a maintenance crew down here with a cutting torch. Now!" he ordered, grasping for any solution, no matter how crude. Across the room, Admiral Thorne shook his head slowly. A cutting torch on a pressurized vessel was a death sentence. The thermal shock could cause a catastrophic hull rupture. Struck, in his panic, was about to turn a crisis into a massacre. But before the Admiral could intervene, a calm, quiet voice cut through the chaos. "That will kill them." It was Anya. She had finally moved from her spot, gliding through the panicked technicians with an eerie, unhurried grace. She stood before a secondary engineering console, her fingers already flying across the keyboard, bringing up diagnostic subroutines that no one else in the room even knew existed. Struck whirled on her, his face a mask of rage and fear. I told you to get out. This is my scene," he bellowed, his authority now a desperate plea. Anya didn't even look at him. "Your scene is about to become a morgue, Lieutenant," she stated, her voice still devoid of emotion. "You have a cascade failure in the primary hydraulic actuators, triggered by a feedback loop from the pressure sensors. The system thinks it's at 2,000 feet and is trying to compensate, but the physical locks are still in their surface position. They're fighting each other. A cutting torch will cause an explosive decompression." Her diagnosis was instantaneous, precise, and utterly terrifying. She spoke with the finality of a physicist explaining a law of nature. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed the faces of the junior officers. They looked from their panicking commander to the calm, authoritative woman he had just assaulted. The Admiral remained still, watching. This was the test, not just for the simulator, but for everyone in the room. Struck, desperate to regain control, blustered. "And what do you propose, observer? You going to fix it with your laptop?" He meant it as a sarcastic barb, a last-ditch effort to belittle her. The irony was that he was precisely right. Anya's eyes scanned the data streams. The digital override is locked out by the mechanical fault. Brute force won't work. The system needs a hard reset at the source. The primary manifold access is in the forward conduit, section gamma, 7-inch. She pointed to a small, unassuming maintenance hatch on the side of the simulator's massive housing. It's a manual bypass, a series of 3 pressure pins that have to be released in a specific sequence, with specific timing, to trick the system into thinking it has equalized. A grizzled chief engineer, a man with 20 years of experience, shook his head. "Ma'am, that conduit is flooded. It's part of the ballast system. And those pins, they haven't been manually accessed in years." The schematics say it requires 3 technicians working in unison. Anya finally turned and looked directly at the engineer, a flicker of something almost like respect in her eyes. "The schematics are wrong," she said simply. Then she began to move. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. It was the physical manifestation of pure competence. She walked over to a large, gray case that had been sitting unnoticed in a corner of the control room. It was her personal gear. Struck and his men had assumed it was calibration equipment. She unlatched it with a practiced flick of her wrist. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, was not a laptop or scientific instruments. It was a compact rebreather, a set of specialized, non-magnetic tools, and a weighted belt. It was the kit of a combat diver. A profound and chilling understanding began to dawn on the faces of the men in the room. This was not a tech consultant. This was something else entirely. She stripped off her gray coveralls in one fluid motion. Underneath, she wasn't wearing a civilian uniform. She was wearing a black, form-fitting dive skin, the kind favored by special operations units for its flexibility and low acoustic signature. The garment clung to her frame, revealing a physique that was all lean, powerful muscle, coiled and ready. The illusion of the unassuming observer was gone, stripped away to reveal the truth of the predator beneath. She strapped on the rebreather, checked the gauges with a series of taps that were as rhythmic as a drumbeat, and secured the tool roll to her leg. She didn't speak. She didn't ask for permission. She was a force of nature, an event in motion that no one dared to interrupt. She walked to the Gamma 7 access hatch, her bare feet silent on the cold metal deck. She spun the locking wheel, the muscles in her back and shoulders flexing under the dive skin. With a groan of protesting metal, the hatch opened, revealing a dark, narrow conduit, already half filled with churning, ice-cold water. The panicked ensign from before rushed over. "Ma'am, you can't. The system is still building pressure. It's unstable." Anya paused, her hand on the edge of the conduit. She looked at the young man, and for the first time, her expression softened for a fraction of a second. "Son," she said, her voice a low rumble, "instability is my baseline." And with that, she took a final breath, slid silently into the dark water, and disappeared. The only evidence she had ever been there was the fading ripples on the surface of the water in the conduit. The entire control room, from the junior officers to Lieutenant Struck to Admiral Thorne himself, held its breath with her. They were all just observers now. Inside the conduit, it was a world of cold, dark, and crushing pressure. For Anya Adebayo, it was home. The narrow space, barely wide enough for her shoulders, would have been a tomb for a lesser person, a one-way ticket to a claustrophobic panic attack. For her, it was simply a workspace. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument of discipline and control, filtered out the fear, the cold, the sheer terrifying blackness of it all. She operated on pure instinct, muscle memory, and a level of training that was almost supernatural. Her rebreather was silent, emitting no bubbles that could betray a diver's position, or in this case, interfere with sensitive acoustic sensors. Her movements were liquid and precise, her hands finding purchase on the slick metal walls of the conduit as she propelled herself forward into the darkness. She didn't need light. She had memorized the schematics. She was building a three-dimensional map of the space in her mind, every pipe, every valve, every weld seam rendered in perfect detail. Her mission was simple and impossibly complex at the same time. Reach the primary manifold, locate the 3 pressure pins, and perform the manual override sequence. The sequence itself was a legend in certain circles, a piece of operational lore known only to a handful of people on the planet. It was developed not in a lab, but in the field during a real-world operation to disable a captured nuclear submarine. It was a technique that required the dexterity of a surgeon, the timing of a bomb disposal expert, and the physical strength to manipulate hardened steel pins against thousands of pounds of hydraulic pressure. And it had to be done in a specific, unbreakable rhythm. Pin 1, hold for 3 seconds. Pin 2, hold for 5. Release pin 1. Pin 3, hold for 2. Release pin 2. Any deviation, any hesitation, and the system would interpret it as another failure, locking down completely and permanently. It was a task designed for 3 highly trained technicians working in perfect concert. Anya was about to attempt it alone, underwater, in the dark. Back in the control room, the tension was unbearable. Every eye was glued to a single monitor displaying the pressure readings inside the main simulator tank. The needle, which had been climbing steadily, had begun to fluctuate wildly. "What's happening?" Struck whispered, his voice a dry rasp. The chief engineer, his face ashen, pointed at the screen. "She's at the manifold. She's engaging the system. The pressure spikes, that's her fighting the hydraulics. They were watching a ghost, a woman they couldn't see, wage a silent war against a billion-dollar machine. They were watching her strength, her will, rendered as a jagged line on a graph. The line spiked violently, then dipped. It spiked again, higher this time. The entire structure of the Leviathan groaned, a deep, resonant sound of stressed metal that vibrated through the deck plates. A few of the younger officers took an involuntary step back. "She can't do it," the engineer breathed. "The feedback pressure is too high. It's going to shear the pins." Or her arm. Admiral Thorne remained silent, his eyes fixed on the screen, but his hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. He was witnessing a level of grit and expertise that transcended training. This was something else. This was the raw, indomitable will of a Tier 1 operator at the absolute peak of her powers. Inside the conduit, Anya felt the pressure fighting back. The second pin was resisting, the hydraulic force pushing against her with the stubborn malice of a living creature. Her muscles screamed in protest, the cold of the water seeping deep into her bones. Doubt, the eternal enemy, tried to whisper in her ear, "It's too much. You can't hold it." She silenced it with a surge of pure, cold fury. She thought of the men trapped in the tank. She thought of the sneering, arrogant face of Lieutenant Struck. And she pushed. She braced her feet against the opposite wall of the conduit, channeling the strength of her entire body, her legs, her core, her back, into her arm, into her hand, into the tips of her fingers gripping the small, specialized tool. The metal of the tool handle creaked in protest. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, shuddering groan that she felt through the water, through the tool, all the way up to her shoulder, the pin moved. It slid into place, seating with a solid, satisfying thunk. She had done it. She had held the second pin and released the first in the correct sequence. Now for the final, most delicate step. She moved to the third pin. This one required less force, but more finesse. It was the final signal to the system's logic board, the digital handshake that would confirm the manual override. Her fingers, though numb with cold and exertion, moved with the grace of a concert pianist. She engaged the pin, held it for a 2 count that felt like an eternity, and then released the second pin. For a moment, absolute silence. No groani metal, no hydraulikis. Just the sound of her own controlled breathing in a rebreather. She had either saved them, or she had just sealed their doom. In the control room, the jagged line on the pressure monitor flatlined. It dropped from a peak of several thousand psi to 0 in less than a second. A collective, disbelieving gasp swept the room. Then a new sound, a loud, powerful hiss of escaping air, followed by the deep, resonant clang of locking bolts retracting. On the main view screen, the icon for the outer hatch flipped from red to green. A voice, hoarse and filled with relief, crackled over the comms from inside the tank. "Control, this is Alpha Team. The outer hatch is open. I repeat, the outer hatch is open." What the hell just happened out there? Lieutenant Struck simply stared, his mouth hanging open. He looked at the monitor, then at the dark, watery hole of the Gamma 7 conduit, then back at the monitor. His brain refused to process what it had just witnessed. It was impossible. It was a miracle. The chief engineer was the first to find his voice. "She did it," he whispered, his voice filled with a reverence usually reserved for gods or ghosts. "Holy Mother, she actually did it." A few moments later, a hand appear at the edge of the conwood hatch. Then another. With a lithe, powerful movement, Anya Adebayo pulled herself out of the water, landing silently on the deck. She was slick with water and grease, her dive skin gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. She pulled the rebreather from her mouth, her chest rising and falling in deep, controlled breaths. She didn't look triumphant. She didn't look exhausted. She looked professional, as if she had just completed a routine diagnostic. She walked back to her gear case, picked up a small towel, and began methodically drying her face and hands, the red mark on her jaw now a deep, angry purple against her dark skin. The entire room was frozen, a tableau of shock and awe. The rescued SEALs were now climbing out of the simulator, looking around in confusion, their eyes eventually landing on the silent, dripping woman who had just saved their lives. It was into this charged, reverent silence that Admiral Thorne finally moved. He walked slowly, deliberately from his position across the room, his footsteps echoing like hammer blows. He didn't stop at the engineering console. He didn't stop to check on the rescued SEALs. He walked right past the shell-shocked Lieutenant Struck and came to a halt directly in front of Anya Adebayo. The room held its breath. The old admiral, a living legend in the Navy, and the unknown woman, a specter of impossible competence, stood face to face. The contrast was stark. The decorated officer in his crisp, formal uniform, and the operator in her functional, dripping dive skin. Thorne's face was unreadable, a granite mask of authority. He looked at the ugly bruise on her jaw, then met her calm, steady gaze. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. And then, the Admiral did something that sent a shockwave through the room more powerful than any physical blow. He brought his heels together with a sharp click. His back went ramrod straight, and he raised his hand in a slow, perfect, textbook salute. It was not the casual salute an officer gives a subordinate. It was the formal, profound gesture of respect reserved for a Medal of Honor recipient, or for the flag itself. It was an admiral saluting an enlisted sailor. The sight of a two-star admiral rendering a formal salute to the unassuming woman in the dripping dive skin was so profoundly shocking, so contrary to the rigid hierarchy of military life, that for a moment, no one in the room knew how to react. They were witnessing a violation of protocol that was simultaneously the ultimate affirmation of it. Rank and regulation had ceased to matter. Only competence and courage remained. Anya Adebayo, her face still a mask of professional calm, returned the salute with a crisp, economical motion. It was the salute of a senior enlisted leader, respectful but not subservient, an acknowledgement between two warriors who understood a language that had nothing to do with the insignia on their collars. After holding the salute for a beat longer than protocol required, Admiral Thorne lowered his hand. He then turned, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces in the control room until it landed, with the force of a physical impact, on Lieutenant Struck. Struck, who had been frozen in a state of horrified disbelief, flinched as if he'd been struck himself. Senior Chief Adebayo, the Admiral's voice boomed, filling the cavernous space. It was not a conversational tone. It was the voice of command, of judgment, of history being written. The title hung in the air, electric and heavy. Senior Chief, the highest and most respected enlisted rank, a leader forged by decades of service. The foundation of Struck's arrogant assumptions that she was a civilian, a low-level nobody, crumbled into dust. I believe I heard Lieutenant Struck offer you a new assignment, Thorne continued, his eyes still locked on the pale, sweating lieutenant. Something about a towel and a hot coffee. I suggest you carry out that order. Immediately, Struck's paralysis broke. He stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet before catching himself. He looked wildly around, as if searching for an escape route from the nightmare his life had just become. He stammered, "Sir, I didn't know." "That is precisely the problem, Lieutenant." Thorne cut him off, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "You didn't know. You didn't ask. You made an assumption based on the most ignorant and superficial criteria imaginable. You saw a woman, a black woman, in a place you considered your domain, and you filled in the rest with your own prejudice. You didn't see a sailor. You didn't see a professional. You saw what your own bigotry wanted you to see. Thorn took a step toward Struck, who shrank back. "Let me illuminate for you what is you failed to see." The Admiral turned slightly, addressing the entire room now, his voice rising again to the level of a formal address. "For those of you who are confused about what you just witnessed, allow me to introduce you. This is Senior Chief Petty Officer Anya Adebayo. Her call sign in the community is Nyx, and for very good reason. She tends to operate in the dark, where the real work gets done." He paused, letting the name and the ranks settle over the crowd. The rescued SEALs, now standing together and listening intently, exchanged looks of dawning comprehension and awe. The name Nyx was a whisper in the special operations community, a myth, a ghost story told to new recruits about an operator who could supposedly do the impossible. They had just seen the ghost in the flesh. "Senior Chief Adebayo," Thorn continued, his voice like a litany, "has more confirmed hours in contested submerged environments than every single person in this room, myself included, combined. She was one of the primary architects of the very rescue protocols this exercise is meant to test. Protocols she developed based on 3 separate direct action missions she personally led. Missions that are so classified, the reports you will one day read about them will be sanitized fictions." Thorn pointed a finger at the complex schematic on the main screen. "She helped design this simulator. She knows every circuit, every valve, every line of code in this machine because she has seen the real-world versions of them fail under enemy fire. Her current assignment is with the Naval Special Warfare Development Group. She is Red Cell. Her entire job is to come into facilities like this, unannounced and undercover, to test our readiness, our procedures, and our leadership. She is here to find our weaknesses." The Admiral turned his head and looked pointedly at the livid bruise on Anya's jaw. Then he looked back at Struck, his eyes blazing with a cold, righteous fury. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more menacing than any shout. "She just found a catastrophic one." Struck looked like he was about to be physically ill. The blood had drained from his face, leaving it a sickly, grayish color. The weight of his actions, the sheer, monumental stupidity of them, was crashing down on him. He had not just insulted a senior enlisted leader. He had assaulted a living legend, a revered operator from the very community he so desperately aspired to lead. He had failed the test in the most public and humiliating way imaginable. Thorn wasn't finished. He took another step, his voice regaining its booming authority as he continued to educate the entire room. "You see this, Senior Chief? You see the lack of rank on her coveralls? That's not an oversight. It's a tool. It's camouflage. In her world, respect isn't worn on your collar. It's earned in silence and demonstrated through action. You see her silence in the face of your disgusting tirade? You mistook that for weakness. You fool. That was discipline. That was the professional restraint of a woman who could have dismantled you, physically and psychologically, in less than 5 seconds, but chose not to because she had a mission to complete." He gestured back toward Anya. "That Navy Cross you might have read about, the one awarded for action in the Helmand River Valley, that was hers. She held off a platoon of insurgents from a compromised position for 3 hours, protecting 2 wounded teammates, using a captured PCAM machine gun after her own rifle was destroyed. The Silver Star from the Strait of Hormuz incident, also hers. She boarded a hostile oil tanker under fire in high seas and single-handedly secured the engine room, preventing the crew from scuttling the vessel in a critical shipping lane. The list of accolades went on, each one landing like a body blow on the psyche of Lieutenant Struck and his coterie of followers. The Admiral spoke of black ops, of classified missions, of acts of valor that would never be public knowledge. He was peeling back the curtain, revealing the truth behind the myth of Nyx. He was giving them a glimpse into the real world of the quiet professional, a world of sacrifice and competence that made Struck's parade ground arrogance look like the childish posturing it was. When he finally finished, the room was utterly, completely silent. The only sound was the gentle hum of the now stable machinery. The rescued SEALs, hardened operators in their own right, were looking at Anya Adebayo with an expression of profound, almost religious reverence. They were looking at one of their gods. Admiral Thorne let the silence hang for a long moment before delivering the final, crushing blow. He turned back to Struck one last time. "Lieutenant, you are relieved of your command of this training evolution, effective immediately. You will report to my aide, who will escort you to your quarters. You will remain there until you are given your new assignment. I assure you, it will be one where your remarkable talent for making assumptions will be of no use whatsoever. Now get out of my sight." Struck, his face a ruin of shame and despair, could only manage a choked, Aye, sir." He turned, his shoulders slumped in defeat, and shuffled out of the control room, not daring to meet the eyes of anyone he passed. The Admiral watched him go, then turned back to the room. His eyes fell on the group of junior officers who had laughed at Struck's initial insults. Their faces were now masks of fear and shame. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," Thorne said, his voice hard as iron. "The most dangerous people in the world are the ones you don't see coming. Your job as leaders is to recognize competence, no matter what uniform it wears or what it looks like. You failed that test today, Senior Chief Adebayo," he said, turning back to her, his voice softening with respect. "Your red cell report is going to be extensive." Anya, who had finished drying her tools and was now calmly packing her gear case, looked up at him. "Yes, Admiral," she said. It was the most she had said all day. And in the weight of those 3 simple words, everyone in the room could hear the promise of a reckoning. The story of what happened in the Leviathan control room did not spread like wildfire. It spread like a shockwave. It moved through the Naval Special Warfare Center at Coronado with the speed of light, transmitted through hushed conversations in the Chow Hall, encrypted messages between operators, and late-night calls back to home base from the visiting SEAL team. The initial reports were fragmented, almost unbelievable. A lieutenant had been publicly dismantled by an admiral. A civilian tech had single-handedly saved Alpha Team from a tank. A mysterious woman had performed an impossible feat of engineering and strength. But as the details crystallized, a single name emerged from the fog of rumor: Nix. For the younger sailors and junior officers, it was the first time they had heard the call sign. For the seasoned operators and senior enlisted, it was the confirmation of a legend. The ghost of Devgru was real, and she had just walked among them. The narrative became known almost instantly as the Adebayo override. The term captured the dual nature of the event: the physical override of the simulator's failed systems and the moral override of Lieutenant Struck's toxic authority. The story became a parable, its details embellished with each telling, as all good sea stories are. In some versions, she fought off sharks in the conduit. In others, she held her breath for 15 minutes. In the most popular retelling, she didn't use tools at all, but manipulated the pressure pins with her bare hands. The fictions didn't matter. The core truth was what resonated. A quiet professional, underestimated and insulted, had proven her worth through undeniable competence, her actions a silent, thundering refutation of ignorant prejudice. The ripple effects were immediate and profound. Lieutenant Struck, as promised, was given a new assignment. He was reassigned to the base quartermaster's office, tasked with inventorying supplies. It was a deeply humbling public fall from grace. He went from commanding the Navy's most elite warriors in a billion-dollar simulator to counting boots and blankets in a dusty warehouse. The demotion was not just punitive, it was educational. Admiral Thorne wanted every sailor on that base to see the consequence of confusing arrogance with leadership. Every time an officer saw Struck loading a pallet jack, they were reminded of the price of hubris. Every time an enlisted sailor walked past the warehouse, they were reminded that competence was the only currency that truly mattered. For his part, Struck went through a painful but necessary transformation. The initial weeks were a blur of shame and anger. But the solitude of the warehouse gave him something he'd never had in the echo chamber of his own ego: time to think. He replayed the events in the control room over and over in his mind. He remembered the calm in Anya Adebayo's eyes, the impossible stillness as he struck her, the fluid efficiency of her movements as chaos erupted around him. He contrasted it with his own panicked screaming, his flailing, useless orders. He began to understand. His authority had been a costume, a role he was playing. Hers was innate, forged in crucibles he couldn't even imagine. About a month after the incident, he sought her out. It took him 2 days to find her. She wasn't in some high-tech lab or a secret command center. He found her on the Grinder, the legendary asphalt quad at the heart of BUD/S training, quietly mentoring a young sailor who was struggling with his knot-tying skills. She was patient, her hands guiding his, her voice low and encouraging. She was a teacher. Struck approached her hesitantly, his dress uniform immaculate, his posture stiff with nerves. "Senior Chief Adebayo," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of all its former arrogance. She looked up, her expression unreadable. The young sailor, recognizing the disgraced lieutenant, quickly and discreetly moved away. "Lieutenant," she acknowledged, her tone neutral. He stood before her, a man utterly broken and trying to piece himself back together. I came to apologize," he stammered, the words feeling heavy and inadequate in his mouth. What I said, there is no excuse. It was unprofessional, dishonorable, and wrong. I was arrogant, and I was ignorant. My behavior was a disgrace to this uniform. I am truly, deeply sorry." He looked her directly in the eye, and for the first time, she saw not a bully, but a man drowning in the wreckage of his own character. Anya listened to his apology in silence, her head tilted slightly. When he was finished, a long moment passed. Struck braced himself for a tirade, for a dismissal, for anything. What he got was far more disarming. "Your apology is a start, Lieutenant," she said, her voice calm and even. "But apologies are words. The lesson is in the action that follows. You disrespected me because you judged me by my appearance. The real test is not whether you can learn to respect me. The real test is whether you can learn to respect the next person you meet who doesn't look like what you expect." She then turned her attention back to the length of rope in her hands. "The bowline knot is the king of knots for a reason, Lieutenant. It's simple, it's strong, and it will not fail under a load. But you have to learn the fundamentals first. You can't just fake it." It was a lesson in knot tying that was also a lesson in leadership. It was the most profound guidance he had ever received. He stood there for a moment longer, then simply said, "Thank you, Senior Chief." He turned and walked away, a man who had just been given a second chance, not by a forgiving admiral, but by the very person he had wronged. Meanwhile, the legend of the Adebayo override continued to grow, taking on a life of its own. Inside the Leviathan control room, a small, unassuming brass plaque was mounted to the wall next to the Gamma 7 conduit hatch. It was installed without ceremony in the middle of the night. It read, "The Adebayo Override. Competence is the only rank that matters." The plaque became a touchstone. New technicians and officers assigned to the simulator would be brought to it on their first day. The chief engineer, the same one who had witnessed the event, would tell them the story. He would tell them about the arrogant lieutenant and the quiet professional. He would point to the plaque and say, "Never forget. The most important person in the room is often the one who isn't talking." Anya Adebayo, true to her nature, deflected all the newfound fame. When a young SEAL from Alpha Team, the one whose comms had crackled with relief, approached her to thank her, she didn't engage in war stories. Instead, she pulled him over to the engineering console. "You're welcome," she said. "Now let me show you what actually happened. The weakness wasn't in the machine, it was in the protocol. Let's walk through the bypass, so you know it for next time." She spent an hour with him, meticulously explaining the hydraulics, the electronics, the delicate balance of the system she had mastered. She wasn't building a legend around herself. She was building competence in others. Her legacy wasn't the single act of heroism. It was the knowledge she passed on, the standard she set, the culture she was quietly, methodically reshaping. She remained a ghost, a quiet professional moving through the shadows of the special warfare community, leaving behind not a trail of glory, but a network of stronger, smarter, and more humble warriors. The passage of time has a way of turning events into folklore, and folklore into foundational myths. A year after the Atabeo override, the culture at the Naval Special Warfare Center had tangibly shifted. The incident was no longer just a story, it was doctrine. New officer candidates arriving for their advanced training tours were told the story on their first day, not as gossip, but as a formal part of their leadership curriculum. The lesson was clear and uncompromising. Assumptions are a liability, ego is a vulnerability, and respect is earned through competence, not demanded by rank. The plaque next to the Gamma 7 conduit became a site of pilgrimage. Visiting SEAL teams would make a point of stopping by, touching the cool brass, and reflecting on its simple, powerful message. The story of Nix became a tool for the instructors, a perfect, real-world example of the quiet professional ethos they strove to instill in their trainees. The most powerful testament to the change, however, was the man who often told the story. Lieutenant Struck, after a year of penance in the quartermaster's warehouse, was given a second chance. Admiral Thorne, a man who believed in breaking leaders down only to build them back stronger, had been watching him. He saw Struck's genuine remorse, his newfound humility, and the diligent, uncomplaining way he performed his menial tasks. He saw a man who had learned the hardest lesson of his life. Struck was eventually reassigned, not back to the Leviathan, but as a junior instructor at the Basic Underwater Demolition/SEAL Bud/S training school. It was a position of immense responsibility, shaping the very character of the next generation of operators. On the first day of every new class, as the exhausted, shivering candidates stood at attention on the grinder, Lieutenant Struck would stand before them. He was a different man. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet gravity. His voice was steady, his gaze direct, and he would tell them a story. "My name is Lieutenant Struck," he would begin, "and I am here to teach you about your greatest enemy. It is not the man who will shoot at you. It is not the cold of the ocean. It is not the pain in your muscles. Your greatest enemy is your own ego." He would then proceed to tell them the story of the Atabeo override in unflinching, excruciating detail. He spared no part of his own failure. He told them of his condescending words, his blind prejudice, his violent act of stupidity. He described his panic, his incompetence, his utter unraveling in the face of crisis. He painted a portrait of himself at his absolute worst. "I stood in a room full of professionals," he would tell the wide-eyed candidates, "and I was the only amateur. I wore the rank of a leader, but I had the character of a fool. In front of me stood a senior chief petty officer, a warrior who had seen and done things I could only read about in classified files. But I didn't see her. I saw my own reflection in the mirror of my prejudice. I saw a woman, and I assumed she was weak. I saw a black woman, and I assumed she was out of place. I saw silence, and I assumed it was fear." He would pause, letting the weight of his confession settle over the young man. "That silence," he would continue, his voice filled with the conviction of a convert, "was the sound of discipline. It was the sound of competence. It was the sound of a professional who was so confident in her abilities that she didn't need to say a word. She proved her worth not with her voice, but with her actions. She saved 12 of our brothers that day. And in doing so, she saved me from myself." He would then point to the motto carved into the grinder's pavement. "The only easy day was yesterday." That applies to your character as much as your body. Every day, you must fight the urge to take shortcuts, to make assumptions, to let your ego write checks your skills can't cash. The person standing next to you, the instructor yelling in your face, the quiet technician you walk past without a second glance, they may be the one who holds the key. Your job is to have the humility to listen, the wisdom to see, and the character to respect competence in all its forms. His speech became a legendary part of the BUD/S experience. It was a raw, honest, and powerful lesson from a man who had learned it the hard way. He had transformed his greatest failure into his most effective teaching tool. He was becoming the leader he had once only pretended to be. As for Anya Adebayo, she remained Nix. She moved on to her next assignment, Another red cell operation at another base, another chance to test the system and find its weaknesses. She never spoke of the incident at the Leviathan. She never wore the Navy Cross or the Silver Star on her uniform. Her legend was not something she cultivated. It was something she generated, a natural byproduct of her existence, like heat from a fire. Her legacy wasn't a plaque on a wall or a story told to recruits. Her true legacy was in the quiet, incremental changes she forced upon the institution she served. It was in the young officer who paused before making a snap judgment. It was in the SEAL who took the time to learn the engineering of his own equipment. It was in the humbled lieutenant who learned that true strength was found not in command, but in character. True respect is a mirror. It doesn't show you the other person, it shows you yourself. Lieutenant Struck looked at Senior Chief Adebayo and saw only his own ugly, unexamined prejudice. He saw a world that confirmed his biases, a world where he was at the top and she was at the bottom. The Admiral, a man whose wisdom had been earned through decades of observation, looked at the exact same woman and saw a legacy. He saw discipline, courage, and a level of professionalism that represented the very ideal of the service. The person they were looking at never changed. It was the men looking who were revealed. Anya Adebayo's silence was her power. It was a vacuum into which others poured their assumptions, their fears, their respect, or their contempt, and in doing so, revealed their own true nature. Her quiet competence was a force of nature, an irrefutable truth that, once demonstrated, reordered the world around it. It taught an entire generation of warriors that the loudest voice in the room is often the weakest, and that true authority comes not from the rank on your collar, but from the unassailable truth of your actions. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where silent discipline defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.